Welcome everybody for taking the time out today to attend our webinar. We actually intend this to be a series of training events, helping and sharing in what we're seeing with our customers and the research that we're doing in the market. And one of the key things we're seeing, and we really considered a tipping point for information security, is that user context matters, and it matters more than ever these days. And we're going to kind of give you an overview about what that means, where we're seeing it change, and talk about the technical difficulties it is to really get down to understanding what your users are doing in your environment and how some of the older systems that are in place today are hindering that ability to get that really detailed, nuanced behavioral aspect, and how some small to medium-sized businesses can actually almost like jump the chasm and be able to get to that level of efficiency without a huge investment in some of these older traditional technologies, and how it can help also larger organizations. I'm Kim Singletary. I'm the head of sales and marketing here for Change Dynamics, and I'm joined today by Jody, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jody Brownell. I'm the Director of Content and Services here at Change Dynamics. Glad to be here.
So part of this webinar series is we're going to make it as informational as possible, and I'm going to be, in essence, asking Jody some very typical questions that we hear from the field, and also try to leverage his experience. He's had quite a bit of experience with SIM and with IT technologies, both on the consumer and vendor side, and see what we can come up with. So one of the strong points about this, I feel, is a lot of people look at this and like, well, hasn't it always included people, process, and technology when you talk about the trifecta for information security? And yeah, it has. But I think a little bit of the trend we're seeing is that the nuances for behavior these days is not just about giving users access and understanding that they have access to things and what they're doing, is the subtleties of their behavior over time. And that's what I think we are missing in information security. So we're going to look at, that's my concern, we're going to look at what the stats say about some of the research. Obviously, people, they're users anywhere, all times of the day. Data is everywhere, whether you're creating it, consuming it, or just viewing it. And technology, we know that the infrastructure and cloud utilization is ever changing. And some of the key innovations out there are actually making it more difficult to understand and keep a tabs on information security and where it's going. So some of the top level stats here I thought were important to kind of pull out, and I'm sure you feel the same way too, is that 74% of organizations feel vulnerable to insider threats. And I want to clarify that, we look at insider threats not just as malicious insiders, your typical possible espionage or malicious doers inside the organization, but also threats that have breached your perimeters, breached your controls, and they're now inside your organization. They've come through email, whatever vector, but they're threats inside your organization that they're hard to find. But an even bigger number, and this is really astounding, that 88% do not have a formal or ongoing data classification process. I think it's really, we know that this is important, but formalizing it, having a way to actually track data, because the days are gone of all data is important and it's all got to be protected at the same level. Nobody has the budget or resources to do that with the speed and the amount of the data out there. So a data classification practice is really probably the one way to really start to fix information security, make it easier and more effective out there. And I think that's what the stat is reflecting, that they're concerned that they don't have a formal process of doing it. And the last one is that we all know 83% say IT complexities just continue to increase the security risks out there, whether it's the technology itself about not having coverage, or the fact that it's just moving so fast and IT is now just participating as part of the organization, but they really don't have the ability to say no anymore. nor do they want to. I mean, they don't want to be a stopgap for the organization, but there's not a great way of understanding risk when you do go forward with things. So those are the top level. And I think I wanted to really hone in on what exactly of those categories, and here's some other stats that really kind of show the state of information security today. So out of all of those, I feel vulnerable to insider threats, when you narrow down some of that research, what I came across was interesting is that 71% are more concerned about inadvertent data breaches than they are about the malicious ones. Again, people trying to get their job done, do the things that in their very narrow focus that they feel is right and they need to get done, but in essence brings the organization into risk. And those inadvertent data breaches are something that's very something you can control, right? It's not a malicious act, but it's just inadvertent, and there'd be a better people, process, and technology merge to help with that. And the other one is that 59% are using manual processes to identify sensitive assets. Regardless of having a formal data classification practice, having a manual process in such a day and age of being able to automate and machine learning seems so contradictory to the aspect that improving information security and being able to protect that data. And lastly, I think this is not an unknown, is that 76% are really concerned about integrating third parties into their internal networks and their applications and what kind of security risks. And we've seen a lot of the major breaches out there perpetrated because of third-party network and third-party risk, which is becoming a hot topic in the industry. So in general, is there a strategy for managing all of these unknown and changing risks? I mean, we've seen the concerns at every angle, and we summarize its internal data breaches, its identification and location of sensitive data, and its third-party risk. So I'm going to now talk with Jody and really have a discussion about why user context matters, and to our point, even more so today. And one of the aspects, too, of this informational, we're going to talk about understanding user context, but how we can get better at our cybersecurity efforts and how we can get a better ROI by looking at user context for cybersecurity. So, Jody, I think everybody can read what's on the screen. Of these five things, finding out the who in their user and resource mapping, their role, their actions, the change in their baseline, and of course their history over time, having that long index. What do you think is the most difficult one to capture today?
The most difficult one to capture today, realistically, so the products that are out there today capture most of this information. The problem is it is not putting it together very clearly, right? So, if you think about log management products and traditional SIEM products, they gather, information from the hundreds of different endpoint and point products, I should say, the hundreds of different point products that are out there. And they're bringing this together, they're consolidating the information, they're making it available. What's not happening is they are not putting together the picture to clearly show in an easily consumable manner who the user actually is, what the role actually means to the user, and what they're doing with, as that user with their set of capabilities. So it's very hard to put together a very simplified picture of what is going on today, right?
And I couldn't agree with you more. I think, but there's two things on this chart that I think we get tripped up on, is the role. There are a lot of technologies today that you can interact with your Active Directory. You can actually have someone go upload based on access control lists. Here's, predefine the roles. Joe is in accounting. Bob is in finance. All of these things. But I think in user context, as we're seeing, that already introduces some sort of bias to it, because again, if we're looking at the stats and going backwards and saying, well, it's a manual process for documenting the critical data in your organization, how up to date are actually these roles in these people in these organizations? Do you think that's kind of a little bit of an issue that we're dealing with right now in terms of also when you think it's in the right role and it's going to slant and skew the results?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a concern there. I think that if you consider the metric that you put out there, right, and if people are not classifying the data and people are being put into these groups, if there is not a process around maintaining that, so first of all, it's not being done, in the first place. If it's not being maintained, then there's definitely cause for concern that these things are going to what's the right term? There's going to be some drift there, right? So I kind of look at role, what a user does, and how their their groups are named and stuff. It's kind of just like one other indicator. It's a great indicator when it's surfaced and it's put in the right context, but it's only one other piece of information. It can help us. It does provide some additional context, and it's great context to have. But it is one that, without the proper practices in place, it has less value and introduces some considerable risk.
I think that's a good segue because, I hear everybody talking about trying to find anomalies. And this is that's one area when you talk about understanding the users and their roles. You always see, hey, well, this user acted outside of his role, but then you didn't have an updated role, so now you have kind of a false positive. You're chasing down these false positives. So I think, the fundamental fact we need to get better at not just identifying anomalous. There is a fact that all anomalous behavior is a precursor to threats and information security risk, but not all anomalies are threats. And, I think we've been so accustomed in not having a fine-tuned way of easily understanding user context, we run into that scenario where we are increasing our false positives because we are just looking at the anomaly. We're not looking at the behavior over time or how it relates to, cross-relating to all of these context elements we just showed you. So, and so here's a great example. I mean, I'll let Jody talk through this of not having a clear understanding, a narrative to know about what users are behaving within your organization.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite charts because it really shows where the tools of today are kind of, in my opinion, falling down, right? So, kind of look at the tools of today, right? We've got log management, we've got the SIM vendors, and they've done, they've spent the better part of the last 10, 15 years putting together technology to bring together, terabytes, hundreds of terabytes of data across these great big organizations, and they've done a great job. They bring together this log data, this flow log data, but the problem is what they've done is they're surfacing only a very minimal amount of data, right, or a minimal amount of information or context, as we're calling it now. So their big promise was to provide a single pane of glass to look across all of these various devices and to surface the value of those devices, but then to provide another layer on top of it so you could do these cross correlations or to derive these insights across these devices. But the problem is the nature of the data that they're working with. One big problem with it is there's just too much of it, right? You take any device that's working at too low of a level. Firewall is one. You could look at some of the endpoint devices that are working at the kernel level. They're generating too much information. There's too much of it. It's too sparse. And what really happens is you get sort of these dashboards that are, you can see in this chart that, it's basically based on counts. It's based on a bunch of raw metrics, and it can show you sort of a point in time, but there's no real picture there. There's no story. It's very hard. It's very hard for you to go there and say, this is what Kim was doing. This is where she was. This is how her story has evolved. And this is why it's important for you to pay attention to Kim today.
I think that's a great point. And I think I just want to clarify. I think all this data is great, right? And if you have the right skills, you're talking about, if you've got this dashboard, and I have years of experience of being in forensics and threat hunting, and I'm, looking at a large organization, this might be fine because they can correlate. They have that, but I think one of the key aspects is, um, for improving information security is being able to digest this information so that even IT generalists who, might be responsible for the organization that Kim works at and, should be able to quickly and easily look at something and go, wait, that's not right. Let me go understand what's going on and let me go investigate without having to know a whole heck of a lot about the threat and correlate all of that. It really kind of comes back to people. The more I can have a story about the people and what they're doing and their behaviors, the better I can understand, well, is this, a business risk? It might not be, or it might actually be a systemic issue that we want to look, a risk event of interest that is multiple things that have piled on that all of a sudden start flagging, hey, this isn't quite right. And I can make a few phone calls or go, talk to a few people or go look at a few data points, and I can start taking action about what's happening here. And again, it's, with the skills gap that we're seeing, and also the fact that all size businesses are starting to need this kind of level of capability, it's something that user context today we're seeing it's much harder than it ever was. So I think, Jody, you touched on this a little bit. A lot of people think that, again, IT sometimes makes things more complicated than it should, that user context requires really deep introspection of all activities on an entire focus on their user space. And I think that's interesting. I think there's been a lot of vendors out there that have totally focused on this kernel level introspection. Unfortunately, and I'll let Jody talk about it, it has to be, in terms of unreliable, it tends to make systems unstable. It also, again, it's a lot of data about all those little files that are changing on a system. And it doesn't actually get to, a lot of times, it takes a long time to follow that breadcrumb to say, oh, this is actually a risk event out there. And I think the bigger one is that, and I think, when Google changed the paradigm for web traffic SEO and making encrypted traffic the priority, there is so much encrypted traffic with HTTPS and applications and websites that you really don't understand. You don't know what is flowing in and out of your organization, and that's becoming a huge black hole. And I think, we talked about before about the feeding through of reliable enterprise systems like DNS and Active Directory, and if you have any sort of identity and access management tools, of being able to understand the role and the group. And so, Jody, do you want to comment on this a little bit? Especially, I think the user context in terms of what it means and what we can look towards for understanding that cloud traffic, that HTTPS traffic.
Yeah, sure. So, the kernel level introspection, you take that one off the table right away. I mean, there's a lot of value in having really great tight integrations with the kernel, both Linux, Windows, Mac. There's some great value. There's some great insights that can be derived. But what we really need to do is get and stay in the user space, right? And this actually goes right to the first point here around HTTPS, right? Every website out there is encrypting, right? Even the ones that don't necessarily need to be, but it seems to be an easy win for websites to say, hey, now it's more private. The areas that made the most sense was, of course, your business suites, right? Your Office 365 is an obvious example of something that should always be encrypted. The problem is, we want to be able to see what it is that the user is doing. So the more applications that you actually have on your network that are encrypted, the actual less visible, the traffic is and everything else within them, right? So you actually start to lose more and more context as users visit more and more encrypted sites or use encrypted services, right? So we want to be able to we want access, we want to get the context from the different enterprise services, but it's incredibly important for us to see unencrypted traffic. We want to make sure that there is an integrity within our network infrastructure. There's privacy. We want to make sure that, you know, users are only able to see and do the things that they're supposed to see and do, but at the same time, at an organizational level, we need to be able to protect, you know, at a higher level and overarching. And so we need to be able to see on that other side, and we need to be able to see what the user's doing, the services that they're interacting with, how they're interacting with it. And quite frankly, that comes down to the data itself. So the services, the data, and then, you know, leveraging those other enterprise services to make sure that, you know, this is actually okay, right? Does that make sense?
I have a question for you about
Sure.
that. So when you talk about the data, does that mean that you know, we should have IT, you know, almost like do full stream and do screen captures and actually capture the data that's being created, viewed, or consumed in terms of, you know, the actual content of the data? Or are you talking about data in a different aspect?
Well, I think there's a few ways you could take a look at it, right? So if you go back to the old embed days, you know, the view of the world that you got there, and you largely, you actually still have that, you know, 10 years down the road. This is what you have in products today. You basically have a user has source IP to dest IP, you get a protocol. You know, I was looking for, you know, so say I'm accessing something on OneDrive, right? Or I'm accessing a file share. And, you know, but basically what I get is I get some volumetric data. And, you know, it says using this protocol over, you know, from this host to this host, and that's all it gave me, right? There's not a lot of context there. Whether I should be doing it, should not be doing it, you know, I would have to go and do some other correlations with another source of information, right? Now, that's on the extreme, you know, on one far extreme. The other far extreme is of you know, what you said about capturing video and watching, you know, everything that everybody's doing and trying to, you know, that's sifting through, I think, a different needle in the haystack, right? I think there's a very delicate balance, right? And I think that if we see a user going after a resource, all we really need to know is where they're going, what they're accessing, and getting just enough information. We don't need the data itself, but we do need to see, you know, the metadata about those artifacts that they're going after. So in the case of the file share, what is the share? What is the directory name? What are the file names? And what are the actions that they're taking on them? And so if I have that, if I know Kim, as you know, to carry on with an example from earlier, if we have Kim and she's an engineer or she's in marketing, and now she's talking to all of our development repositories, or, you know, flip that around into, you know, any different way you want, it'll seem absurd. Whether a developer is talking to, you know, something in finance, or finance is talking to engineering servers, and, you know, we can very quickly make that determination without capturing all your packets, all your flows, without capturing movies, and we can present that in a very, very succinct format and paint a picture and give that narrative. So somebody, without being super technical, can say, Kim did this and this is wrong. Like, this just stands out as, you know, this is probably one of those things that shouldn't be happening.
No, that's a great point. And, you know, I think, you know, what you're triggering on is, you know, kind of what I call user context reimagined. It's the ability to graphically make some sort of sense and have the drill downs and, you know, kind of what we're calling this at a glance narrative. Real users, real identities, and, you know, giving you this discernible next steps, but also giving you a broader aspect across your organization, not just finding the threats, but finding what's changing over time, finding, you know, large amounts of percentages, like, you know, my organization was, you know, I saw, you know, X percent of change across my finance group, you know, during last quarter's end, but this quarter's end is very different, right? Those things are kind of like broader triggers. We've never had capability of seeing before that I think would really start to change the paradigm for information security and really, talk to having this reimagined user contact. So Jody, do you want to just, drive through a little bit about that graph there with that person in the middle, and maybe kind of going back to, having the aspect of resources and metadata relationships?
Yeah. So the great thing about this particular diagram here is that I can, with one glance, depending on how I enter this diagram, I can very quickly decide that a user has been communicating or interacting with different resources through different hosts. This picture here allows me to very quickly determine what it is, that happened, the volume that it's happened, and it gives us a way to basically twist and turn the data in a way that makes sense relative to the organization itself, right? So it shows us users, it shows us hosts, it shows us enough data about the information that I can, twist it and turn it, and I can go find something very easily. But 99% of the time, the picture is all that I need, right? I can very quickly go from Mr. Rogue, and from Mr. Rogue, it shows me this is why you're looking at Mr. Rogue, right? So if we look at just these two pieces of information right there, whether I'm looking at Dan or Mike or Mr. Rogue, when I go into Mr. Rogue, I can see that Mr. Rogue has been interacting with certain types of resources. He has been communicating across a number of different hosts. But what we can see that's most important is we can see the path, right? And from any one of those points, I can change my perspective and I can follow a different path, right? So instead of going through and, looking at, high-level sort of counters of what happened over a certain period of time, I can actually go and say, time is obviously always going to be a factor, but I can go in and look and say, hey, whether, the time span I'm looking at is, the last hour or this weekend or a quarter or, this time over several months, I can go in and basically it will be called out, and the picture is there, the narrative, the story is actually right there in front of you to sort of, start, making decisions, right? You don't have to go into your hunter mode where you're starting to say, okay, I've got these numbers, and now I've got to sort of decompose these numbers, and now all of a sudden, already I'm right into raw log data or flow data, and then the minute you start talking about that, now I have to actually understand what generated that data, what these like messages actually mean, right? Instead of, like you were saying earlier, when I'm looking at a level like this, when I'm looking at the context, what they have done, where they did it, the types of things that they interacted with, these are all associated with the business, right? Mr. Rogue, that's his business name, right? We get his role, we get his department. All that stuff will be, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think that's a big aspect about information security. It's the shift from monitoring the infrastructure, right? Where there was always assumed the firewall was your first defense, and these servers were critical, and these endpoints were the workhorses, and you monitored from that aspect, and you wanted to make sure everything was good. But it's just so changing so much. There's too much dynamic instability around what you're assuming and what you're not assuming with those, that if you change the focus on users, I think it's clear to the business about what's at stake. Really talking about that the people, process, and technology. And I think when you look at some of the ways that companies are doing it now versus some of the things that we're proposing as this new model, just the effort alone will start changing going forward if we change this paradigm. I think Jody said it before. Yes, you could probably get to user contacts with a lot of effort behind it. And I'm going to let him talk about, in order to get to that level of contacts that we just described and we just saw, here's what all the things we kind of say are required, and here's the effort it takes to manage and monitor them.
Yeah, it is not an easy task, right? I mean, And this is a, this is a very short list. It could go on and on and on because of the number of products that are actually out there and how they are emitting their data. Um, the the model has to change. It has to be simpler, right? Today, if you look at to get the right amount of context, and to me, the right amount of context is as little data as possible, right? So we've gone through this sort of evolution of capture everything, provide a single pane of glass, and then hopefully, we have these skills that the skills in-house that can actually make sense of, that that view that we've given through that single pane of glass, right? But the number of devices that have to be coordinated and be emitting their log data and capturing the flows off the network it's a monumental undertaking, and the cost of the infrastructure is huge, right? The newer model, like we were talking earlier, is capturing just enough of the context. So what is the least amount that makes the most sense, right? And that should be very, very simple, right? We shouldn't be relying on now we're always going to rely on the different controls that we have in place, and they're always going to have a place within our organizations, right? We're never going to get rid of our perimeter defenses, but it shouldn't be an engineering effort when a organization wants to get user context. It shouldn't be taking a product such as one of the existing log management or SIM vendors and trying to figure out how to derive all that information and building a whole system on top of theirs. And that's almost what it would take today, right?
And I think what what you're talking about is the fact that the quality of data. Like if I have a large amount of data, it's going to take me quite a bit of time to parse through that. But if I have better quality data to begin with, data that really points to that user context that's unbiased, and I think it's the key aspect here, right? You're leveraging machine learning to get to that, to actually self-assign the roles and the work groups. Your outcome is going to be better. And I think that's a lot of people use the word analytics, and it tends to be this little black box. And you had a point, we've talked about this in the past, about analytics is selling models, right? Not selling a solution.
Yeah, no, for sure. So fundamentally, I mean, there's a couple of things here, right? One, to go back to what I was saying a second ago, getting the right amount of information, and that is purely the context. We don't need all the peripheral information around it. We don't need to know, all the baby steps. If we take the example, did my kid get to school today or not? It's like that's kind of a yes or no. Do I need to know, how many steps it took down the hall, how many, classes they looked in along the way, how many people they talked? No. Did they get to class on time? Yes. Did they get there safely? Yes. The context is, how many pieces of information did we remove from getting from point A to B, right? And there's going to be all kinds of pieces of supporting information along the way. But fundamentally, what we really care about is just enough information to make that determination, right? We don't need the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of peripheral information that, yes, it could help us, but at the end of the day, it's probably a distraction, right?
Yep. So that, takes us to the kind of progressing forward here. About detecting anomalous behavior. We kind of talk about user context a lot, but we need to talk about the breadth and depth, right? So one of the key things we've already focused is that organizations need it across all of their organizations, across all their cloud services, because without that, you're going to have a gap. You really can't understand behavior unless you understand how one area of the business might be correlating to another area of business, or one user who might be in finance in the U.S. is correlating to another user who's in finance in Brazil. Especially for geographically diverse locations, it's a really good way when you have that breadth of coverage to understand what's going across them. And then also historical, right? Understanding, not only what we're seeing from a current anomaly perspective, but over time. And, this is just part of that right data. It's kind of leveraging saying, to your example, like I don't need to know how many steps my kid took down the hall to get to class. He got to class. But I would like to know how many times he got to class on time versus how many times other people in that school got to class on time. And that's, looking at the historical aspect that a lot of these tools have limitations because you're collecting and storing so much data that you're not be able to do that over time from a historical perspective. And I think the key here is how do we improve information security, get a better ROI for our efforts, and make sure that this benefits all sizes of organization. I think you totally explained it well, Jody, is getting the right type of data at the right time and not just trying to parse through all this data that we could possibly collect for information security. So we're going to walk through some use cases that will probably bring these things to light. We're not going to spend too much time on this. Probably in the next 10 minutes, walk through 3 that we've identified. I'm just going to set it up, Jody, if that's okay with you, and then you and I could just kind of talk about where some of these use cases might go. Here's one. We talked a lot about user contacts, and we kind of said, hey, that internal data breach might not always be a malicious insider. The focus research kind of talks about inadvertent data breaches. And here's one also where the user is actually a vector for a data breach. So we hear this in the news quite often. Email has basically a Trojan or a payload in it that they receive a resume from HR. They open it, nothing happens, at least from a user perspective. She doesn't see anything happen to it. But yet in the background, something is happening where install is happening, and then there's these other things that happen over time. Data is transferred from one host to another. Connection to a remote service has happened. And again, more installation of resources on other systems within the network. And so, Jody, from a not too technical, but some of a technical bench, you want to kind of walk through this scenario and how user contacts would be able to help in these very common day-to-day risks that are happening across every organization.
Sure. So this one here is actually a very easy attack, and it's not an uncommon attack. It's a little easier to address nowadays, but it's a great example of how easy it is, and anybody can launch this type of attack. It is so very simple. It's so very dangerous, but it really highlights the value of user context, right? So, as an HR person, as an HR personnel, on a day-to-day basis, I'm always going to be using email. I'm always going to be opening PDFs. So, I'm always going to be, reading email, opening PDFs, I'm going to be, editing Word documents. There's going to be a set of tools I use, servers that I talk to, and things that I do, right? And what happens, what's the beauty of that combined with what you were talking about earlier with behavioral profiles is that we will figure out what is normal over time for somebody who is in HR and who does this type of these types of activities day to day, right? So when something like this happens, right? One of your points earlier were that anomalous behavior is always a precursor to something bad happening, right? Well, that is absolutely true. So if you think that somebody in HR, they get, we go through this scenario, they open up a PDF, the PDF, it looks benign, nothing happens. So, the unsuspecting person, they throw it away. It's like, oh, that was a dud. That's fine. But in the background, right, that user context, if collected properly, will show us right away that, hey, a different process has started that we've never seen before. This host on the inside of our network is talking to a host that has never talked to before, hopefully. We're sending and receiving data in a way that we've never seen it sent or received before, maybe encrypted, probably is. What are the other types of things that payload is going to be doing, right? Is it scanning local shares? Did it launch other utilities that it downloaded, or did it, look for other compression utilities or anything like that? My point is, though, that all of those things are anomalous to that user and probably her entire group, and that will stand out, right? But that's not a ton of information. If you think about the difference of that little bit of user context that I spun off there compared to what we would have to look at if we only had a log management or a SIM, we're talking ones and tens of pieces of information as opposed to hundreds and thousands of pieces of information. And we could very quickly, with the right user context, put together a picture of exactly what happened. And you could, from that, discern on what actions to take.
And I think the next use case really, this is a use case, that internal data breach, that a lot of people talk about because it is so pervasive, so common, and also so dangerous. But I think the next use case would kind of help with this people process technology that we're, framing together of, why do threats target certain groups, certain people? That's, the number one vector, is because they have access to the sensitive data. But if you don't know where the location of that data is, how do you understand that user as it interacts with those data and those applications that have the sensitive data? So in this use case, we're kind of looking at two very different groups. One user is a developer, the other one's in finance, and the activities are all the resources and applications they use. And in the end, these two use cases that they're based on real customer stories, to tell you the truth, actually is something unusual that we would able to detect. Again, we talk about effort, that if you had a log or a SIM and other things, yes, they probably would detect it, but the effort would take so much, and you don't necessarily have to have all of that in place. So for one example here, this story where a developer, he's a developer for an organization, worked remote, and then he actually subcontracted his job to others, to an outside firm. Now that brings a whole bunch of issues about intellectual property and access to tools and locations that he just basically passed his credentials on to that subcontractor. And he was able to subcontract his job out for a lot less and basically reap the benefit. But that brings in a whole bunch of compliance and risk to the business here. And in that case, the user context, by focusing on that, actually found this quite quickly. And I'll have, Jody walk through maybe more of the technical aspects of where user context would have picked this up, because even though it was passed on credentials, there are certain key elements of the behavior that we were able to tell this wasn't actually the prime developer.
Well, in this case here, it starts to look really, this one here is actually really simple on the developer side, right? When you start to look at things from a geo perspective, where people are logging in from, that's pretty straightforward. But at the end of the day, in this case here, you're going to see differences of, for this to truly work. You think about it. One day I am logging in as Jody from Corporation XYZ, and I'm doing this job, and I behave a certain way. It does not matter how you cut it. As a person, I develop between certain hours. I use certain tools to do things. I use an email client. Because of the tools I use, the data behaves a very, very certain way, and it becomes predictable over time, right? if I just, because I'm subcontracting that work out, if I were to try to reuse my credentials because I am, firmly integrated in this other organization as a contractor, and I have to share those credentials with somebody else because now they have to look like me, everything is going to change. Where I'm logging in from, right? So so IP analysis, all the tools, and where my data is traveling to and how it's being acted on. The entire profile is going to change. This particular use case would be picked up so easily. It's quite funny, and it would actually be quite hard without some very, very specific rules in other systems.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key. I mean, I think in some of these other systems, you actually have to almost write rules to look for these. It's like writing a whole worst case scenario book of rules and hoping you never find them. But who knows if you've written all the worst case scenarios versus looking at behavior, going, hey, this is a behavior that we've not seen before. We can correlate it with several other events out here. It doesn't fit this profile that we've been baselining for the last 6 months, and that starts to trigger up some risk events of interest. So talk about the predictability. You can't predict all of the bad things or all of the unknowns out there, but you can at least do behavioral analytics and find them in the other way.
That can really, you're really touching on something that's really important, right? The entire security market, the reason why everybody is speaking about analytics these days is to get to that, that state of being able to provide predictive security analytics. SIEMs are in the same place as, antivirus companies were a few years ago, where because everything is rule-based, it's really no different than a signature, right? And what's happening today is people are, taking malware and they're taking their attacks and they're adjusting them just enough to get by the signature. So, these systems that are signature-based and not behavioral-based, truly behavioral-based, like, as a fundamental component, they are always going to be one step behind. They will never be able to handle a 0-day. And if they don't have that understanding, if you're always based on rules, you have to have such an intimate level of knowledge of your changing organization, your ever-changing organization, your ever-changing data, and every threat that's out there, even the ones you haven't imagined. There's no way anybody can win in that scenario.
And I think that's a good segue because you talk about being able to identify this, and it's not, we haven't talked about anything here about malware. We just talked about users behaving badly. And the second piece of this location of sensitive data, being able to understand from a user context that they themselves, now this is kind of more of a malicious insider or a compromised one, we're not sure the motive behind this, but finds that they quite clearly are misdirecting funds because they're starting to use systems that they've never used before, unauthorized systems, and they're in a high value role being in finance. They have access to wire transfers, things like that. And this is something that, because we see across and we're monitoring and doing analytics across peer groups, that this is really an outlier anomalous behavior and can, start to trigger that as a risk event of interest. Now, again, it's a risk and it's a threat to the business, but again, no malware is involved, but it's a serious information security aspect that sometimes it's just harder to detect.
Yeah. Yep.
We're going to go through these pretty quickly, but also want to show you that third-party risk is consultants coming into your organization. They might be, doing some help with financial analysis or putting together reports and whatnot. So they have access to some critical systems. And then also vendors in the traditional sense of network-connected vendors, but also vendors that are API connected. And the fact that they're not necessarily prime users of your organization, but you're giving them access to your organization, we can also track their user context and know through analytics that some of their behaviors are going to be risks to the business. And I'm going to let Jody kind of briefly talk about these two use cases and how user context will help.
So this really is no different than the earlier examples that we were talking about. You know, whether it is, you know, the same consultant or, you know, a group of consultants, we are going to, because we're doing the behavioral analysis and we're looking at the resources that they typically interact with. And again, that is your remote servers, the resources on those servers, and local processes. So all your local tools, your local data, your remote data, how you're speaking to them, we can establish what people look like and how they do their job in very, very simple terms. And because of that, when there is a deviation, whether it be the volume of data, how they bring it, how they store it, if they package it up, if they put it on a USB key, all that stuff is going to stand outside of it. So unless the person has been violating all the rules for a very long time and they've always been a bad actor, the minute that they start to deviate from what is their typical job, they are going to stand out as anomalous, right?
And I'm going to highlight the two use cases here because these are actually from our customers. And so in the first case, in the consultant, they came on board to do a specific scope for their job. They had access to a certain amount of data, but because of poor hygiene in setting up the access control list, and they basically had multiple consultants and they kept giving them the same privileges, they actually were giving them too much privilege. They had access beyond the scope for their work and had access to really sensitive information, and we were actually able to identify when one of them went out of bounds for accessing the data he needed for his contract, and actually started to exfiltrate information. We're not sure if it was malicious or he was just, thought it was part of his role, but that was something that was quickly identified. And on the second one, on the network side, I mean, even though it's not necessarily a person, user context helped here in the fact that over time, an API connection, we actually saw that there was inconsistencies in the resources and the time frames that the transactions were happening based on this API connection. So the source destination were the same, but the time frames in which those transactions were happening, and then the payloads in terms of the size of data that was being transmitted between those two communications changed quite enough to trigger a risk event. In essence, it was a risk, and it was a somebody had actually compromised that connection and that API, and were doing things outside the scope of what that was intended for. So third-party risk is very critical in both the persons that you're entering into your organization, but then also the network and the API connection. So, I really want to thank Jody for joining me today, and I think it's been great having his point of view and talking about a little bit more on the technical side. As I said, we're going to have this as a ongoing webinar series. We also, if you have any questions, would like a copy of this presentation, or would like to see a demo of our product, feel free to use the link below where you see this posted. And then finally, we actually have a user context challenge, and you can see in the box below where this is posted. We'd love to hear from you. Something specific that either you're dealing with today or a scenario that you want to imagine and challenge us to say, hey, how would you identify this? Or something that you've dealt with in the past that you just wish you had a better way to understand that behavior and how that anomalous behavior turned into a threat. We'd love to hear from you and walk through and share with you how that might be changed in terms of the resources and effort to find that. And again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next webinar coming up soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.